Let's talk about two of our favorite games here in America, that being basketball and our professional league, which is the top of basketball around the world, the NBA, and American football and our NFL league here. And the efforts of both of these leagues to try and expand internationally with varying levels of success. My guess is that if you did, as was assigned, the reading in the Gaming the World book about these efforts by the NBA and the NFL to expand, you might have been surprised to learn about how long the effort has been going on the part of the NFL to expand globally. So when we think about American football, the authors make this analogy to the religions, the two variants of Christian religion being Protestant and Catholic, and they compare football, rugby, what we would think of as the handling codes of football, so rugby or American football or Canadian football, all where you handle the ball itself, as being analogous to the Protestant religion, and association football, which we call soccer, as being analogous to the Catholic religion. Now that may seem like a strange analogy to make, but I think that it's worth noting because it very much influences the possible development of the code outside of its native country. And what I mean by that is the Protestant religion, if you grew up as any of the Protestant denominations, so that could be Baptist, it could be Methodist, it could be Episcopalian. I actually grew up in a Quaker church, believe it or not, yes, famous for running the Underground Railroad, the Quakers, and many of our American forefathers, the revolutionaries, were Quaker in their religion. But anyway, that's beyond the point. It's just another denomination of Protestantism. All of those denominations have their hierarchy and their managing structure, but they're not connected by an overarching Protestant organization that manages those denominations together, right? They're all separate from each other. Kind of like Canadian football is separate from American football, which is separate from rugby union, which is separate from rugby league, right? And there's no overarching organization that controls all of those handling codes of football. On the contrary, in association football, there is an overarching organization that controls all of the different leagues of association football, what's called the dribbling code of football. So there is a governing body over the Premier League in England and the Serie A, which is the Premier League in Italy, the Italian league. MLS reports to this governing body here in the States and in Canada. La Liga in Spain reports to this governing body, and that governing body, of course, is FIFA, right, that controls all of the soccer leagues. Sort of like the Pope and the Vatican hierarchy controls all of Catholicism around the world, or manages all of Catholicism around the world. So in that way, that analogy is somewhat applicable to this situation, because when you have a controlling body over all the different leagues under that code of football, that controlling body can help to grow the sport across borders, right, and help to establish leagues in other countries of that particular code of football. The governing body can help make that happen and direct resources toward that. But when you don't have an overarching governing body, like the handling codes of football don't have, then it's up to the league itself to try and expand across borders or outside of kind of its native area. So that's why it's important to understand that distinction between the hierarchy structures of these two different codes of football. So American football, which we're focused on today, do I have a rooting interest in American football? Well, you might know from previous sessions that I'm from Northeast Ohio, so you might think, boy, is that guy a Browns fan? No, I'm not a Browns fan, although I do have sympathy for the Browns. But no, Bengals. is the way to go. So I've got my Bengals gear on. I'm going to identify myself as a Bengals fan with the merchandise here. And the Bengals have, of course, relatively recently participated in the latest overseas venture of the NFL in playing games in London. And we're going to talk more about that in just a minute. But the London games are not the only effort. They're just the latest effort of the NFL to try and globalize the game. And previous efforts have been relatively unsuccessful. To put it kindly, they've actually been pretty much failures, I would say. Starting with the World League of American Football, which started in the early 1980s and actually featured teams both in the U.S. and teams overseas. So we'll watch a quick clip, of the first World League of American Football game to be played overseas. Actually, I said it was in the 80s. I believe it's in the 1990s. Yeah, it looks like 1991 was when this was played. And you'll see that it features Barcelona, but also a team from New Jersey playing against what was called the Barcelona Dragons.
Not long ago, it was a marquee name with white shoes and a Fu Manchu mustache who came along and gave a fledgling new football league credibility and stability. And now a brand new football league searches for its identity. The World League of American Football. The United States takes its passion global, full of flavor and potential. Are prepared for battle as we ready for the season premiere of the World League of American Football on ABC Sports. The New York, New Jersey Knights take on the Barcelona Dragons. You are looking live at Barcelona, Spain, where American football comes to this country for the first time. The New York, New Jersey Knights travel here to play the Barcelona Dragons. And folks, first down now for Barcelona inside the 20. Fans are into this, aren't they? This is Palmer on the cutback. Inside the 5 to the 1. First and goal for the 1. Carr, touchdown, Barcelona. The 1 series. Ernie is back. Dragons with the ball at the Knights' 43-yard line. Straight back, beautiful pass. Touchdown, Barcelona. American youngsters into a brand new environment and mold them as a football team. Ernie rolling out for the Dragons. Bust to the end zone for a touchdown. TV broadcast for the use of this telecast without the express written consent of the World League is prohibited. The final seconds ticking away. And Lewis breaks free. Gets to the 1-yard line. Kip Lewis. He played with basically a running offense down at Arizona. And he almost bolted into the end zone. It looks like the Knights are not going to be shut out here with 35 seconds to go. Tony Jeffrey is the running back behind Graham. Draw into the end zone for the Knights' first touchdown. 25 seconds to go.
All right, right, so you get some flavor of the the World Football League there. You might have recognized the voice of that commentator, Brent Musburger, broadcasting the game. And you also saw a quick clip when they showed the crowd. A few of you that were watching intently might have noticed the Castilian flag, which is that region of Spain where Barcelona is. And we talked about the pride in Catalonia when we talked about El Clasico. And you also heard, or hopefully noticed, that Brent Musburger mentioned that all the players, a group of young American players, meaning that all the players were from America. Of course, there's not much of a grassroots presence for the sport to grow up and raise athletes capable of playing even on that level out of Europe. There were 2 slots that had to be filled by people from the country where the team was located in the World League, and those were typically the kicker and the punter, as you might imagine, if you had to guess at that. And I put on here a 16-year adventure because that's exactly what it was. It was an adventure. The teams moved around to different cities frequently, trying to find the right home and support. Eventually, they folded all the teams in North America and went with just NFL Europe, and then later changed the name to Europa. And eventually, in the last iteration of that attempt at internationalizing the sport, there was only 6 teams left, and 5 of those 6 teams were in Germany. The other team, I believe, if I remember correctly, being in London. And you're familiar with most likely the recent effort of the NFL, which has been to just focus, instead of creating a whole new league in Europe, but focus on taking some of our teams from America in the NFL over to play games in London. We're going to watch another quick clip here of just a couple minutes on the reporting about some of those games here.
Finally tonight in football, the Miami Dolphins beat the Oakland Raiders today 38-14. The game was in London. Charlie Daggett reports from a city that's become the NFL's home away from home.
Get on your feet and make some noise!
Every year around this time, this chunk of turf in London looks and feels a lot like America. This is the NFL going long, with 3 regular season games in London for the very first time.
There's so much going on in the game. It's so fast-paced. It's great. We love it. The glitz, the glamour. It's got everything.
Is it time for an NFL franchise in London?
I'd love one here. It'd be fantastic. I think it would really cultivate the passion that UK fans have for the game.
And that is what's making the NFL pay attention. All those glorious British accents. They're Dolphin fans, they're Raiders fans, but these are die-hard football fans.
This is not an American audience, says the NFL's VP of International, Mark Waller.
In fact, quite the opposite. About 88% of the fans are UK fans, the vast majority from the London area.
The NFL says there are now 12 million fans in the UK, and sports broadcasters saw a 60% audience increase last year alone.
All American football games take place here at Wembley, the home of English soccer, and they've all been instant sellouts. In fact, there are now 30,000 season ticket holders.
Critics say there are huge issues to a London franchise, like who wants to live here full time, and what about the crippling jet lag? But that growing fan base is getting increasingly hard to ignore.
And would you consider yourself a Raiders fan?
I am now.
You are now.
And it's that kind of enthusiasm that has fans here dreaming that one day, one team will call London home. Charlie Daggett, CBS News, London.
I just happened to notice there, I don't know if you caught that, but apparently the Dolphins fans wear Bengals jerseys or Bengals shirts, as one of the fans there had a Bengals jersey on and a Dolphins hat. I've got my own Dolphins helmet here. I'm not really sure how I acquired this, but apparently the Dolphins and Bengals go together, according to that video. Nah, I don't know. I'm just kidding around. Anyway, so you see that the media in this clip sort of represents, I think, a lot of the attention that's been given to the London games. in our U.S. media saying that, wow, this is really popular, and it seems like the people in England are really picking up on our sport of American football. And when they talk about 30,000 season ticket holders, of course, what they're talking about is not season ticket holders to a particular franchise, but people that buy a season ticket to all of the NFL games that are played over in London. And since this video was made, they've started also playing games at another facility besides just Wembley in London. And I think, at least from what I heard from some of our graduates of NKU that worked for the Bengals, when the Bengals went over there and played in London, they seemed to be relatively surprised that it wasn't, their impression was that American football wasn't as popular in London as they had anticipated. I remember one of our grads mentioning that, you know, going in and out of the hotel, they expected it to be a little bit like America, and that people would recognize that they were professional athletes and you know, maybe greet them with autograph requests and things like that. And on the contrary, she said that it seemed like nobody really knew who they were, and nobody really knew what was going on until you got within about a quarter of a mile around the stadium, and then you had all of the fans that were there for the actual event that of course recognized what was going on and who the players were and things like that. So she at least was relatively surprised and expected, based on the US attention that we've given the London games, that in London there would be a bigger deal than they actually were. Another thing brought up in that video was some of the barriers to putting a national franchise in London. I'm not so sure about that question that the commentator said, who would want to live here full time? I've been to London a couple times, and it is a very nice city, and with a lot of benefits to it, but perhaps what that commentator meant or reporter meant was that you would be certainly far away from your home in America. The jet lag is an issue, right, and the travel time, which is why there's been much speculation that if they put one franchise in London, they're probably going to have to put two franchises in London so that they can, and put them in the same division so that they could play each other twice a year, which would reduce their need to travel back and forth to the U.S. At least for a couple weeks during the season. So what are the barriers to American football growing internationally? Well, we mentioned some of them there, and the fact that there's not really any grassroots presence for the sport, or not much of a grassroots presence for the sport, for kids to be able to learn the language of American football, right? To learn about the sport. That's started to change from a spectator standpoint, in that people can now watch many more NFL games on television than they used to be able to watch before the second globalization, the digital revolution that allowed for a lot more cable channels, more sports channels that need programming, and now they're putting on more NFL games in Europe on television that creates some degree of exposure over there. It seems that this strategy of taking actual NFL teams to London is more effective than trying to create a minor league as NFL Europe was. Sort of like the struggles that we've seen with soccer in the US, sports fans want to watch the best of the best for the most part, right? And they knew when they were watching NFL Europe that they were not watching the best players in the world, but in the NFL, by taking NFL franchises over to Europe, those fans do get to see the best players in the world at American football. Certainly, the fact that we call it football, and in many parts of the world they call soccer football, creates a pretty significant barrier just from a language standpoint. We might be better off, or those in charge of American football in the NFL might be better off, if the sport had gotten another name or title that didn't conflict with what they see as the most popular sport in the world in many parts of the globe. So there's that language conflict that creates an immediate comparison to soccer. Also, of course, American football is seen as being very American, and that's not always a good thing in certain parts of the world. While in other parts of the world, consumers are very hungry for American culture, so that could actually be a benefit. Also, there's this last issue here that you see on the list, sport versus entertainment. So there's some question of whether if you put one or two franchises in London, will the novelty effect of football wear off? Meaning, are the popularity of these games in London just because it's not always there? You know, is it people going for the entertainment aspect of the game and not necessarily going as a hardcore supporter of a particular team, willing to buy merchandise, buy that season ticket and support that team even in years when the team is bad, right? So that's certainly a concern as well. Are they there to learn about the sport? Are the fans there because they appreciate the sport and they're learning about the sport, which would lead me to think that they're going to be more long-term fans, or are they there just for the entertainment aspect, and once that wears off, you know, we might see a waning in the popularity of American football over in London. We'll see. Only time will tell. Obviously, the NFL is hoping that its interest in the sport itself. Another barrier on London itself is, just like the U.S., London is a pretty crowded, hegemonic sports space, meaning there's lots of sports that are based in London that are well known with sports fans in London, that to try and crowd into that space that's already crowded creates a difficult proposition. Here's a nice little map of the world that shows us where the sport itself, meaning soccer, association football, where is it called soccer and where is it called football? And that gives us some idea of where there might be conflict to American football in the language aspect. Of course, here in the U.S. and in Canada, we call association football soccer, so there's not a language conflict with our American football or Canadian football. You see in many parts of this map, it's written in the native language, but the coloring effect helps you, right? So those countries that are in pink or peach have either literal translation or a variation on the word football. So that would include Russia, most of Africa, all of South America, and of course Mexico. And then the blue portions are where they either call it soccer or some derivation close to soccer, with it basically being us. Also, Ireland, they call it soccer, which may surprise you. Australia, they call it soccer. Of course, they have their own version of football. And then in South Africa and other parts of southern Africa, you get soccer or some variation of soccer. All right, let's move on to basketball. Basketball is probably the second most popular sport globally behind soccer. The authors call it the second global sports language. And missionaries played a huge role in the YMCA, which is you might not know this, but is a missionary organization, or originally started as a missionary organization. The C in YMCA stands for Christian. And so what happened was, when missionaries tried to spread Christianity around the world, these are primarily Catholic missionaries, they would go to parts of the world and establish hospitals and schools, right? And where they would establish schools, they would have recess or athletics as part of that schooling. And that helped to spread baseball to certain parts of the world, but it also spread basketball quite a bit to other parts of the world. The Harlem Globetrotters were ambassadors for the sport of basketball and for the U.S. The Harlem Globetrotters have quite a history to their organization, and they were known as the Ambassadors of Goodwill. That was their nickname, meaning ambassadors for the U.S. around the world, but they also spread the sport of basketball around the world and played in communist countries even during the Cold War as sort of a basketball diplomacy, if you will. A small footnote in this chapter in the Gaming the World book was the mention of the Kentucky Wildcats and Adolph Rupp's team losing to Texas Western University over a decade, almost 2 decades after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in baseball. The UK basketball team was still an all-white squad, and they lost in the NCAA championship game to Texas Western, which was an all-black team, and that was a big moment in basketball history in terms of getting the sport more integrated at the collegiate level. And I only mention that because of our location in the state of Kentucky, and I'm guessing that we have perhaps a couple students that are Kentucky fans that might be interested in that historical point. What really accelerated the growth of basketball around the world was when the Olympics allowed professional players, NBA players specifically, to play in the Olympic Games. That was in the Barcelona Olympics in 1992, and that was the original Dream Team that included Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, and Larry Bird, as well as several other superstars, Charles Barkley, Patrick Ewing. The college player on that team, some of you might remember or might recognize, Christian Laettner was the college player on that, the only college player on the original Dream Team. And Jordan played another role in the spread of basketball in that Nike, for example, and some of his other brands as well, McDonald's being another one, but Nike was interested in growing their own brand around the world, and they used Jordan to try and grow their brand in other countries. So they picked an athlete, an American athlete in an American league, the NBA, to try and market their own products, Nike products, in other parts of the world, which at the same time increased Jordan's popularity and increased the popularity of the NBA at the same time that it was increasing the global reach of the Nike brand. So probably that Dream Team was the biggest spark for the growth of the NBA and interest in the NBA around the world. A second spark was Yao Ming. You see a picture of him in the top left there from China, and he was the #1 pick in the draft. And China, of course, has a huge population, and they were very interested in how successful Yao Ming would be in the NBA. And so it created much interest in China in the NBA games, and eventually spread the language of basketball around China to the point where after a few years of Yao Ming in the NBA, while his jersey sold wildly successfully in China, Kobe Bryant actually sold more jerseys in China than Yao Ming. So that's just a sign that fans of sports in China, and basketball specifically, were not only watching the NBA. They might have tuned in initially to see how Yao Ming would do, but then they learned about the sport, they started watching the sport, and learned about many of the other superstars in the NBA, and became interested enough to buy lots of jerseys of players other than just their native son Yao Ming in the NBA. The other thing that happened in China was the Anschutz Entertainment Group, which is based in LA, partnered with the NBA to build many NBA-style arenas in China. And even today, the major professional basketball league in China is called NBA China. So the NBA helped to grow the sport professionally in China, and even branded it as NBA China. So where are the other best professional leagues around the world? Well, not necessarily China. They haven't reached that level yet with NBA China, but Spain, Italy, Greece, and Israel are 4 of the more famous professional leagues in other parts of the world where athletes have come from to play in the NBA, or where NBA stars or NBA players sort of toward the end of their career, or whenever they're not able to make it on an NBA team, will occasionally go and play in one of those leagues overseas because the level of play is pretty competitive. And in Spain's league, there is, as we mentioned before, a lot of the sporting clubs around the world. We know their major premier soccer team, but they also have teams in other sports. And in the Spanish league, there is a Real Madrid team and a Barcelona team. So El Clasico extends. El Clasico extends even to the Spanish Professional Basketball League in the battle between those two sporting clubs. And then I talked about Yao Ming as being the anchor for the growth of the league in China, and the AEG, that's Anschult's Entertainment Group, building an infrastructure in China for the growth of the sport of basketball. We talked earlier about the Nowitzki effect in a different session. We talked about the Nowitzki effect in Germany, and we've started to see that happen, or we have seen that happen over the last few decades, not just with Nowitzki, he's probably the best example because of how great of a player he was, but of players coming from other countries like Yao Ming, like Manu Ginobili from Argentina, Tony Parker from France, coming over, playing in the NBA, the best league in the world, and that increasing the popularity of the NBA back in their native countries. So this diffusion of sports culture, we're talking about the NBA, but it also relates to baseball, which we've talked about. It relates to soccer, diffusing into the U.S., creates the rise of these, what we can call super clubs, where their brand or their club name or franchise name is known around the world. The Yankees fall into that category. In the NBA, the Lakers and the Celtics fall into that category. Probably the Bulls, because of Jordan's influence, fall into that category of super clubs. When we think about soccer, we think about Manchester United as kind of being the first worldwide super club, soon followed by Arsenal and Liverpool, Chelsea, Manchester City, Real Madrid and Barcelona now have built themselves into two of the more powerful clubs, super clubs around the world. And in soccer, you've got a Champions League that creates the champion clubs from each of the different leagues playing against each other at this kind of super league, if you will. And that creates bridging capital. And by that, what the authors mean is that it's bringing together fans from other countries, fans in a particular sport from other countries, to watch one particular league, right, being the Champions League, because you've got the top teams from each of the different leagues all playing against each other. There is sort of a version of the Champions League in Europe around basketball, but of course it doesn't involve the NBA itself, at least not yet, but maybe that's a future possibility for diffusion, further diffusion of professional basketball culture outside of the U.S. And the second globalization has created this phenomenon of super clubs because you don't have to travel to see the team play in person, meaning you don't have to go and be a live spectator at their particular stadium. Because now we get international games, or we get games of foreign teams here in the U.S. and vice versa in Europe, they get some Yankees games, they get some Lakers games, right? They are, and some Cavs games, certainly with the rise of LeBron, and some Golden State games with the rise of Curry and Durant and that franchise. You can just be a viewer. You can be a TV viewer and still really engage or feel like you engage with that team, and it can become part of your identity, right? So you no longer just have to have the option of being a spectator. The world of being a viewer and following your team via streaming or online or cable, watching the games, has expanded quite a bit. International players, as I mentioned before, we're used to it. It's institutionalized into the NBA now. It was very controversial in the early 2000s, late 1990s, when many players in a few of those drafts in the early 2000s were international players. There was a backlash against that. From some basketball fans saying, "Oh, I didn't get to see these players play in college. I don't know anything about them. I don't want my team to draft them." And now that's been institutionalized or accepted in the NBA and in the NHL. They went through a similar phenomenon in the NHL. Now it's totally accepted in basketball. I think, let me see if I have the stat here in front of me. I think it was 20, I might have to go back here, I think, to my notes. 18% of international players was the stat that the authors gave. 18% of the NBA is players from outside of the U.S., so about 1 in every 5 players, which is quite a shift from 20 years ago when pretty much all the players were from the U.S. Now, there's been a long grassroots presence of basketball, like I mentioned when I mentioned the missionaries and the YMCA in other countries. But what happened was you started to see, after the Dream Team, you started to see that grassroots presence grow quite a bit around the world. And it's no coincidence that the Dream Team was in 1992, and we saw this huge influx of international NBA players in the early 2000s, because a lot of those players that came in the NBA in early 2000s were kids when the Dream Team burst onto the world scene, and they got excited about basketball. They started playing basketball more and more, and some of those players, of course, eventually filtered into and made it all the way up to the NBA. So there's a link there that's important to understand when we think about the history of the internationalization of the NBA. And then you have the brands, like I mentioned, Nike and Jordan, but you had Reebok with Allen Iverson trying to create the same thing, taking these American global icons and using them to grow their brand internationally. So it wasn't just Jordan, although he's probably the best example, but it's diffused sort of the sports culture around the NBA to other parts of the world because those brands have taken it internationally. And the entertainment. NBA has been a league that's embraced itself as an entertainment product, and that has also, and there's a thirst for American entertainment in other parts of the world, and so that has also led to the growth of the NBA around the world.